So on the Monday before this last one, February 5th, there was a major stock market drop. The Dow Jones Industrial fell over 1,500 points. In fact, it was nearly 1,600. Now, this represents not quite, but almost 10% of the total value. In fact, this and other recent drops in combination are at nearly 40% of the gains in the Dow Jones over the course of the past year. So, within a 2-week period, there have been fluctuations that have almost entirely equaled all the gains of the past year. This was described by business media, by CNBC, as eye-watering. Now, the question we have to ask ourselves, is this a reflection of anything real? Did any major corporations suddenly collapse? Was there some kind of natural disaster, an earthquake, did a city burn down? No, the corporate press was quick to reassure everyone that this, in fact, had nothing to do with the real economy, that the fundamentals of the economy remained sound. This was only a correction in valuation. A correction is a technical term for when there is a drop in value of approximately 10%. To some extent, this is true. This high level of volatility does have more to do with the increasing dominance of short-term speculative investing, prompted in part by quantitative easing, that is, the large-scale buying up of government securities on the open market by the Federal Reserve, which is done out of an intent to push down interest rates, and excessive leverage. If markets are glutted, if there is an overproduction of commodities, speculation is increasingly the only avenue left to turn a profit. It's more profitable to speculate on derivatives than to open a factory under these conditions. We see something similar in many cases of companies preferring to repurchase shares, their own shares, and cancel them, thus driving up the value of the remaining shares artificially. They do this instead of reinvesting them in their actual operations. To judge from price to earnings ratios, which are currently at double historical averages, we are seeing the second highest level of overvaluation of stocks in American history. However, there are underlying problems in the real economy. For example, despite all the talk of low unemployment and a very seemingly impressive decrease in the official unemployment rate to 4.1%, which capitalist economists will describe as being close to full employment, huge numbers of Americans have left the job market and are no longer reflected in the official unemployment statistics. So to say that the fundamentals of the economy, fundamentally employment is strong, it's not totally consistent with larger reality. So there are these larger underlying problems, but a lot of the talk about certain underlying problems is in fact more motivated by politics and the interests of the ruling class than it is by than by those particular underlying problems. Well, a good example of this is concern about the deficit. Now, it's true that, in theory, certain levels of debt would cause economic problems like some of what we're seeing. But we are not at that point, and more importantly, we are nowhere close to that point. There's no serious concern at this time that any of the holders of state debt doubt its capacity to repay it, and there's no shortage of willing lenders, and at very low interest rates at that. As usual, the most enthusiastic partisans of the capitalist class are seeking to use deficits as an excuse to destroy the social programs that they have always opposed. Likewise, there's been a slight upward trend in wages, and that has prompted talk about inflation fears. Some commentators have even blamed fear of inflation for this stock panic, but the fact of the matter is that the Federal Reserve has made 2% inflation its official target level of inflation. That's the inflation that the capitalist class wants. And in fact, even trying to get it up to that level, we have not hit 2% inflation. So fear of out of control inflation just doesn't seem consistent with the actual circumstances that we're facing. The market also shows very little movement on inflation bonds, so it'd be hard to expect that investors are, expecting high rates of inflation if they're not buying the monetary instruments that would enable them to profit off high inflation. Uh, the working class should remember the next time the capitalists or their various servants in the government or the press insist that there just isn't enough to go around, isn't enough to pay for housing or healthcare or decent wages. We've got to remember how casually they regarded this, drop of nearly 10% in the Dow, how the disappearance of an almost unimaginable amount of theoretical wealth was considered a necessary correction in the ordinary function of the market. At the same time all this was going on, as massive tax cut giveaways were being awarded to corporate interests and to speculators, who did the Department of Labor decide needed to be cut down to size? Tipped wait staff. Wouldn't have been my first guess, but there you go. They've just got it so good already. Some folks here, I'm sure, have worked in the industry or know someone who has, family members or friends. So you may have heard of tip sharing, where the front of house wait staff tip out to back of house employees, dishwashers, and so on. And now that's a complicated issue in and of itself. What's not complicated, however, is the legalized wage theft that the Trump Labor Department is trying to make the industry standard. In the guise of promoting so-called tip sharing, the Labor Department has not only placed managers in charge of administering this tip sharing or tip pooling, which in itself is an open invitation to tip theft by unscrupulous owners and managers. They have outright declared that tips do not ever have to make it to any of the staff, front or back of the house, even in theory. They are instead have full discretion to spend these tips however they like to make whatever improvements to the restaurant they deem necessary. For instance, reducing prices or expanding dining rooms. The Labor Department has somewhat, interestingly said that won't be a problem because if they steal servers, if they don't give servers any of their tips, the servers will just quit. Yeah, I know, like, all my friends who work as wait staff, they're totally in a position to be able to quit at the drop of a hat. That's totally realistic right there. This at the same time that this is going on, there's been new talk about cutbacks in food assistance. They are proposing to replace, food stamps, which are now cards. They're proposing to replace that assistance with government-provided food delivery, shelf-stable items. That is to say, canned and dry goods. No fresh fruits or vegetables or anything or fresh foods in general. Now, it's interesting that this comes from people who will swear up and down how much they hate government oversight, and how they're for individual freedom, and now they want the government to determine what poor people can eat. We always know that when they talk about freedom, they mean it for the rich, but wow, that's really something. But also it's important to note, we know how programs like these work, because this is the model of food assistance that is characteristic on American Indian reservations. And I was just hearing from some American Indian representatives talking about how we have a century of records of health outcomes for how that works. It's not great. I don't quite have the words to do justice to how bad the outcomes of that have been for American Indians. It's an outrage, and that's the model that is going to be exported to the working class in general. And I think these two things, they may not necessarily seem immediately connected, but they're they're perfect examples of the ways in which the ruling class is on the attack. It's looking to claw back whatever concessions have been made to the working class, and indeed, further depress standards of living, further drive down the conditions of the working class, to make working class people more desperate, so they are less able to resist, are less able to organize. And it's a good example of how we need to be united in struggle. We need to be organizing together. what starts out as this horrible policy on Indian reservations is going to be exported to the working poor and the unemployed at large. We need to stop these attacks wherever they start, because this is, an injury to one is sooner or later going to be an injury to all of us. The working class is in this together, and we need to be fighting together. And we can't trust paternalistic reforms or ruling class politicians who pretend to be acting for us out of sympathy. The working class needs its own party, it needs its own organizations, and it needs to fight together. Thank you.